Hi, hello. I'm reshooting video two. I guess I'll probably post the original one, like I did before, and I hope you're able to see these. Let me know if you can't see these videos. Um, I know Asher said that my private setting didn't work, so they're public now, so you can search them, which is a little scary, but you know, private makes it too limiting. Anyway, I wanted to talk about Nnedi Okorafor's stories in a different way than I did in the first video that I shot, because I think I missed some pieces that I wanted to talk about, just particularly for the story itself. That is sort of the anchor of the content that we're talking about this week or last week, week one, and I wanted the focus to be more on the story than necessarily any other piece that's there. Although the TED Talk and the blog posts are really interesting in their own right. So let's get the story itself. I hope you enjoyed the story, and it's um, it's obviously a really quick read. Uh, the the thing that I think that I missed most in the first video was the fact that the story is called Hello Moto. And then that obviously appears um, three different times, three, maybe two. See, I gotta get my stuff straight. It appears in the story, and it was really kind of the publisher to link it to the sound that it would make, particularly for the people who don't know how it sounds. I assume that you are not necessarily aware of that sound. That was something that is really specific to Motorola phones, and it was kind of a cute advertising campaign to some extent. And what's interesting though is that Okafor sees that as something essential to the story, right? I mean, she wrote it with that piece in there for a reason. Short stories, the idea of them is that they don't have anything in them that isn't valuable, important, right? It's not like a novel or even a novella. In short stories, because it's so quick, the author has a lot of time, you might say, or not a lot, and not a lot of space to try to make sure that the story is told in the way that they want it to be told. And so every element, every word of the story is incredibly significant. So Hello Moto in the story plays a significant role. Now, what that is hard to say. This isn't like a literature class or a literary theory class by any means. So I don't expect you to dig into it very much. And I would admit myself, I haven't dug into it at all. My own perception of it is that Hello Moto plays its role in that it indicates or it initiates a situation that we all experience, and that is sort of this being so like uh, obsessed and connected with each other via mobile phones or cellular phones. In both instances that I can think of from the story, where we get the hello moto, both women respond a very similar way. It that that initiates a sense of anxiety to answer the phone. Right, you must answer. They neither of them ignore it. I mean, they like is mentioned in the story. They know who it is. One reason from their telepathy, but the other reason is from coming up with a custom ringtone. But both of them use the Hello Moto in there, and it's there to sort of initiate the sense of sort of the tension and anxiety that we all have around technology that has become so embedded in our lives. And so you might say that that itself is a mechanism that Okafor is using to tell us as a reader that like the story that she's telling about technology um, is one in which there is this um, unnatural naturalness that we've developed. We're creatures that have the ability to adapt significantly, meaning that like we are willing to start to become creatures that require or desire to answer our mobile phone calls, that it plays a significant part in our social behavior, and that having our phone near us is important and valuable to our lives, and that when we receive a call, it is vital that we answer that call, because it means we're connecting to someone or that we're important. It means that we're a part of something, and that mentions in her TED talk um, that she had gone back to Nigeria um, with her family as a child and noticed the evolution of technology in people's lives. Everybody suddenly having mobile phones and computers, and how important those were to connect everybody who had previously been disconnected, and that it was really important for her, and even when she's telling her stories, that the proliferation of this technology made it so that nothing could be done in private or in secret. That if you did something, that there was going to be some sort of picture or a representation of what you had done on the internet, in social media. And so this Hello Moto title, and then the way it plays out in the story, I hope sort of is getting you thinking, well, why is it Hello Moto? I mean, mostly that's what I hoped it would do. Well, why is it called Hello Moto? What role does Hello Moto play here? And I think that's mostly the significance of it. If you're just thinking about why Hello Moto, right? And we're watching a movie, the short film adaptation of the story later on in the term, that's called Hello Rain. The character Rain, and so what I want you to be thinking about is the role here that the director, the creator of the short film, decided to change it from Hello Moto to Hello Rain. So we might think about, well, why has the director made this change from Hello Moto to Hello Rain, and why do they see Hello Moto not being as important to the story as Okafor thought it was? But why would you think that something like that is important? And the idea, though, that what role is technology playing in this story, and how does that connect to the ideas of magic? And obviously, in the story itself, the technology is described as being some hybrid between magic, she calls juju, and the if you know anything, you may have looked up what juju is online. For the most part, that is a sense of magic, and mostly it's the conjuring of demons. Many times, or in some West African cultures, and I've read in some Eastern African cultures, when juju is evoked, it's bringing the spirits, usually from either ancestors or from nature, and that's much more common, would be bringing some sort of element to bear in human form. It could be beyond that, but the juju are mystical creatures many times who could cause disease or illness by taking or by entering into a body. They some people would describe juju as like having epilepsy, and so like you said, that you may have heard this. Somebody might say that's bad juju. I don't know if you've ever heard, hey, that's bad juju, but the idea that it's just evil magic, or magic that's uncontrollable. And for the most part, that's what juju is, at least from my understanding of the history and the cultural significance of juju. Is it's used to try many times to gain power, and by gaining the power, the user tends to lose control of that power, because the juju is too powerful. And so if we think about it in those terms, that combining technology and this magic of juju, it's you start to see a greater overlap in the stories that are presented to us by Alec Ryrie in The Sorcerer's Tale, where we might not have the computer or these and some like these telekinetic or telepathic bionic, I guess you could say, wigs that offer the women this power to take essence and hypnotize or control the people around them. But if we look at it in terms of the technology is much more in the form in the Tudor England period, or even previously when we looked at the first term, the late Renaissance, that the technology in itself was much more in just language. If you look at like the Arabic Renaissance, that idea that the ability to translate texts from the Greek to the Arabic and to the Latin, that itself was a technological significance that afforded those who did so, in beyond that the Hebrew as well, like John Dee looking at the Hebrew alphabet as something that had the ability to actually conjure elements, or just could transform reality. And that's the idea here is that when we look at Tudor England and with the same view, is that these the people, the early, we could even say the early scientists, they look like magicians. They were using formulas. They were using numbers and language to manipulate the reality in a way that looked magical. And so, if we think about like Gregory Winston with Lord Neville, the technology itself was his ability to read texts that had magical symbols in them, like reading the Latin. The Latin in itself could be considered technology. The ability to read the Latin would be like today if somebody was a proficient coder, they had you have the ability to transform realities through the digital realities. But the idea could also be that Gregory Wisdom had access to materials that afforded him the ability to get those around him, particularly Lord Neville, to believe that he could conjure spirits or communicate with spirits who had the ability to bring him luck. Right? The mere fact that he forges a ring to allow Lord Neville to supposedly win at dice games or card games, it's a technology itself. So when we're thinking about the overlaps that are happening, and we look beyond Gregory Wisdom, there are other examples in the Sorcerer's Tale of ways in which people who were using their environments, but particularly like elements of their environments, like like taking crystals and bringing, having demons living inside of those crystals, or conjuring Satan. Those all in every point at which magic is being done, it's not just something where you are, you're doing nothing. You have to have some sort of strategic material that is a conduit between this world and the magical world. And in some sense, it's just language. In the case of Rain, it's her ability to manipulate code, right? That's what I mentioned before. She creates a virus, right? She's able to create these wigs, and she is able to manipulate her reality through her ability to develop technologies that aren't possible in our world or we don't know about. And so at every end, we see this connection between magic and science as the connection between magic and science is really just the technology to interpret, right? The mediating factor, right? So this goes back to science, magic, and religion in general, and that science, magic, and religion are just ways in which we mediate reality, the ways in which we conceive of reality, right? So we conceive of reality through the lens of science when we're able to recognize that something acts a certain way habitually or routinely, and we're able to attribute a theory that is testable to that thing. When we can see reality through magic, when we see something similar, there's a recognizable pattern, but we are not able to establish a clear theory to make sense of that pattern, and so it seems magical to us because we're not able to recognize when or why or how that thing is even happening. So things can move from magic to science pretty quickly as soon as there's an ability, or from our worldview, as soon as there's an ability for us to theorize how and why that thing is happening, and then we're able to test that thing. So if something looks magical, it could easily become scientific just through the ability to test it, right? But in the case of like the story of Hello Moto, we don't have that ability. We do have the ability, though, through particularly the character of Rain, to understand that this is a technology that looks magical because she is unable to, or because she does not keep control of it. It doesn't work the way she wanted it to work. And so when you're perceiving of the difference between like science and magic, you could think, well, a lot of times it might be this something is magical in its ability to transform without our control. That's why, I mean, but suddenly you'd say, well, Troy, does that mean evolution is magic? And that dives right into religion, in that religion has taken on the debate that magic and science are really insignificant, and that what we have to understand is that for us to actually see the world is through a recognition of it, that it is, I don't want to say, I mean, it is animated by a transcendent being, right? And you might say, well, no, that's just magic. No, that's in a sense religion. When we think about what religion means, the definition, religio, if you want to say it like that, in a terrible sort of like Latinate accent, it means the linking back. That's literally the definition out of Latin of religion. And so when we think about what religion does to science and magic, is that it says, well, great. I mean, you can have these phenomenon and look at them one way or the other, but what's more important is that we link them to a transcendent being. And in some senses, if you look at, like, if we just ignore monotheism, right? Let's say, and we look at pantheistic or even animistic religions, the religion there is the fact that the beings, and we could attach juju to this, although it's tenuous, and I would have to look into this much further and possibly have discussions with some West African religious scholars. But the idea is that those things that animate nature at some point came from somewhere, started in some place. So the pantheism that is present in certain religions that look magical, what they all have in common is some transcendent reality, right? That they came from some transcendent reality. You could even Platonism, right? The idea of an idyllic plane upon that we cannot see, that is the basis upon which our reality is created, and then we're able to actually access that idyllic plane through mathematical symbols. And that's Neoplatonism, and that it drives right into where we find our late Renaissance and Tudor England scientists. And I know we didn't get into any of that in term one, mainly because for us to dive so deep into that would be, our class would really have to take on a lot more. But you do have this idea of a religious thinking that there's a transcendent plane. And to some extent, that's what magic believes, is that there's a transcendent plane, and there are beings that live on a transcendent plane and we're allowed to access that transcendence through some sort of technology, right? Through spells, through materials that you find in nature or that have been crafted by the bringing together of specific elements, alchemy. But that religion departs from that and saying, well, it's not, well, to some extent, it's humans are going to be fallible, that humans are not even. So if you look at religion as magic, you would say, well, it's all just the same. Magic and religion are the same. Religion would say, well, no, we might look magical, but what religion is important, the most important aspect of it is the realization that humans are fallible, and because of our fallibility, we need to be constantly reminded that we are fallible, and then that at some point, either by coming together as a community, we can change that, we can support each other, which is a really awesome viewpoint of what religion does, right? It's the optimistic ability for religions to sustain communities that otherwise would disintegrate. So it's like the first great society, you could say, would be religion. And to some extent, that's true. I mean, all of the early religions arose out of agricultural societies who were trying to maintain social order in order to harvest enough food in order to keep civil unrest at bay. And then if we look at it in terms of, well, we'd say, well, yes, we might look magical, like if you think about transmutation, particularly transubstantiation, which is when that word is used, if you've ever read Gulliver's Travels, the idea that the body of Christ becomes real in the prayers that are said, and I know I'm not using the correct terminology, and but the words that are spoken by the priest actually transform the bread, or the unleavened bread, the bread without yeast, into the actual body of Christ. So you ingest his flesh, and the wine, or the juice, the wine is actually transformed into Jesus's blood. That's a lot of magic, you might say. That sounds magical. But the religion would say, well, it looks magical, but it's a miracle presented to us by a transcendent being, right? And so this is what becomes complicated with the conjuring of like Satan or Satanism in general. And we did not take the time that I would like to discuss Satanism. But we will think about it a little bit in the coming weeks when we look at texts like The Power. We're going to come back to Federici's which is witch hunting and women. But this idea of, what's the difference between science, magic, and religion when we look at them all as the ability, or our ability, humans' ability to mediate reality in some form. We can choose these three paths by which we accept what's happening in front of us. And in the case of Nnedi Okorafor's story, she's showing us that, well, by using technology, by mediating our reality through this sort of really hard technology, science-based computer circuitry, you could say, by doing that, we accept a lot of magic, right? We don't understand how these things work. And the wigs themselves really symbolize that sense, in that this acceptance of power without control is really what a lot of technologies do for us, is that we say, well, I'm just going to take this into my life and use it because it's going to make me better at what I do, or stronger in some way. I'll have more, I'll make a bigger impression, right? I'll have a bigger field, like I'll have a larger audience, like if you think about social media. that we're willing to accept a lot of the tech in such a magical way because it's so transformative to our lives. But and she's putting this right in front of our faces, and that's a lot. That's what we see sort of in Tudor England is people were just willing to accept magic because it was so powerful and transformative. Right? It had the ability to actually shape your influence in your life, your social sphere, and so Okafor is like kind of updating that narrative for us in the story. There are a lot of other elements that are interesting, particularly the fact that the women are so vain, but that the wigs are nasty, right? They're like really horrible looking in Okafor's description of them. That's an interesting element too. So this sense of personal vanity, but the tech on their head is grotesque, right? We could probably spend a long time talking about that. One of the students had mentioned, Deshaun had mentioned that, and it could have come directly, he didn't say specifically, but it couldn't come directly from the fact that the wigs were so horrible looking, was that he perceived that the story wasn't this sort of like high tech, magical or bordering on magical narrative, but that the women themselves were imagining that they were capable of doing this, that they had that their wigs sort of convinced them, but that there was no technological intervention. They were imagining that they were heating up, and he didn't say this specifically. This is from what his reading was. It sounded, but that they were committing these petty thefts, and that they saw themselves as sucking the essence out of those around them, because they imagined themselves to have this heightened sense of heightened, I don't know, like super sense, right? This sort of this confidence that they were vain. They made themselves up because they perceived themselves to be that way. And the wigs were some sort of just like totem that that they could that connected them to this perception of themselves, almost like taking a drug, you could say, which is an interesting read of the story, that it would go from sort of science fiction to like really emotionally disturbed psycho thriller type. So I thought that was a really interesting take on the story, and it and that's a great way to, like when you're thinking about responding to the story, respond in however the way you read it, right? You don't have to see it the way you would you would see it, and somebody might argue, well, what about the lasers coming out of Philo's eyes? It's like, well, again, that could just be she's imagining that there are lasers coming out of her eyes, that she feels this power, this sense of self. I mean, it's pretty easy to imagine that there are people out there who do have such an inflated sense of self that they see their world as something that they are sucking the life out of and changing and shaping to in such an extent that it's almost like they have this technological ability, right? And so it also like it says something about the brain, and we will not tread down that path at all. But that idea that what happens to Rain at the end when she decides to take off her wig before confronting the other two characters. For some reason, Philo, I cannot remember the third character's name. I want to say her name's like Coco, but it's not. It's yeah. I'm gonna have to look into it. Anyway, I don't want to belabor it too much, but I think looking at the story, it helps sort of drive some of the points that we've seen earlier. But it also gives us a new look at that Okafor points out, a new look at sort of this African futurism, or the idea of African science fiction and African science. And again, and Okafor points out, obviously, there is no Africa per se; it's a construct. But we should not, just like pan-indigenous societies, we should not believe that there is one indigenous reality or society. but that's really multiple. So that's she's not saying this idea of African futurism is important to her, and in reading the story, it's important for us to see sort of uh, this view of a world where we are understanding magic, science, and religion as something that is not explicitly Euro-American, right? Even though obviously her Nigerian roots are heavily influenced by Euro-American sci-fi, she's really working to drive this political message that African authors need to develop their own sense of geographical science fiction where like it's grounded in the places that they see every day, so that science and technology isn't something that is brought by the colonizers, but that it is something that's created at home, and it means something to in its transformative ability to the sense of place. And it connects like when she's describing the story of the spider writer that lives underneath, the spider artist that lives underneath Lagos, that that connecting the stories to the cultural folklore, and making clear connections that are more significant to the place, than reading something that's written by a European or an American author who's saying something, even if they're saying something about somewhere in Africa and writing a story about Africa, that they don't have that same sense of place. And so the technologies that they deliver to those places are much more in that sort of paternalistic, or that look not growing up from the place in which that technology is needed or essential, or how it's even used in that place, right? You see Arthur C. Clarke is a great example of that, even though you might not think that, okay, he's colonizing the African continent through the stories that he wrote. To some extent, you could say that, yeah, he is, because by using those venues, he is taking something that, even though he thinks that it's valuable in understanding his own world, it's not something within which he lived, he grew up with, right? It's not his culture, from which to write the stories of what could be, right? Even though they might, like Rendezvous with Rama, you know, those stories like that are, they're incorporating these ways of understanding the world, from somebody, yes, who may see them as valuable and wants to disseminate them to the world, but isn't imbuing them with the same sense of place that people who come from that area would in writing these stories. And so that's a significant aspect of what Okafor is speaking to, right? It has this sense of liberation and transcendence on its own, right? It's its own technology. It's its own religion. It's its own magic, right? And the last thing, the idea, she points out in her blog post that idea of definition is so important to her, that she needed to make sure that people understood that she's not an Afrofuturist, right? She didn't understand why this was being applied to her. She didn't see herself as an Afrofuturist because she's not writing stories from an African American perspective. She's not trying to transform the African American landscape. She's writing stories that are meant to transform the African landscape, right? She wants, like she points out in the blog post, it's Wakanda, an outpost of Wakanda in another African country, like in Ghana, right, or something like that. Not Wakanda in Oakland, right? Like is shown on the movie, that it's that when she's talking about African futurism, she's looking at Africans writing for Africans, right? Even though she's writing in English, right? Nothing wrong necessarily with that, other than you could have a long colonial conversation about the use of English to write these stories. Um, it's also significant that she is bringing in terms that are used by the at least from her, the Igbo people that she identifies with. But that's significant as well, sort of bringing in that sense of code meshing that is mentioned in style. You sort of blending the language of the colonizer with the language of the local people. That idea is that's how reality is mediated for the people in that area. It's through this code meshing, and so that's another significant aspect that I hope you recognized. There's so much more to talk about with Okafor, and I hope that you continue looking into her work and the work of other um, and I would even say African writers and African futurist writers, um, and that you appreciate the different ways in which they're presenting our interpretation of the world, even if it's not necessarily meant for you. And I think that's hard to grapple with. Is that you could even say Okafor is not really writing for us, right? She doesn't necessarily care that we're reading her stories because we're not who she's writing for. I'm sure she appreciates the audience and the recognition, um, and that she just wants to influence those who come from a place that has, for at least the last 400 years, um, been seen as um, a backwater of civilization. And I don't want to say that. That's a horrible thing to say. When you think about the fact that our president described some of the places in Africa as shithole countries, that's exactly what Okafor's writing against, right? She wants the people of Malawi, of Botswana, of the Central African Republic, I'll keep naming African countries, of Western Sahara. She wants people, to see where they're from as a possibility and not some place that has been relegated to history and will never come into the future, right? She's writing for a future of Africa. Um, and that's what I think I'm hoping most of all you pull from this, even though it's not necessarily specific science, magic, and religion. It means something to look at a story that is presenting a place as a possibility of and through that we're saying, hey, we're looking at what science, magic, and religion mean to these people, not as something to be studied historically, but as something to be advanced, and to be hypothesized, to be dreamed of, right? That's really the importance of science, magic, and religion, is that it's what's possible, right? So I hope you, again, enjoyed the story, and that I'm looking forward to your discussion of Andrea Hairston's story as well. So see you next time. Thanks. Bye.